Hi, this video is going to be kind of a recap of the history of the church in England, and it's going to move from the earliest Roman days, very sketchily, up into a discussion of what happens when when something we could start to call an Anglican communion begins to form, which includes, of course, the beginning of the church in the US. So Christianity in England started with the Roman period in the 3rd century, and it went underground for a time and was revived after a series of invasions in the 6th century. Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine of Canterbury in 597, and the church, as it began to form at that period, was partly a Celtic church with a Celtic influence coming by way, particularly of Scotland, and the Roman church, right? And those two forms of Christianity are in conflict, but eventually united around the time of the Synod of Whitby in 644. Much of the history of the early church comes to us from the Venerable Bede, who was writing in the late 7th century. So we are going to that's just the quickest description of the very early days of the church in England. And we're going to pick it up really with the Reformation, as we tend to do. There is growing controversy in Christianity, especially on the continent in Germany and France, about what we would now call Protestant reforms, right? Changing of the church hierarchy and new understanding of the sacraments that has a very different take, particularly on the Eucharist, that varies from transubstantiation. We talked about that in our Eucharist class. In Germany and France, with the Lutheran and Calvinist approaches, it's probably true to say that religious reform was tied up with an increasing move toward what we'll call nationalism, or kind of a breaking away from the Roman authority, and also the kind of slowly increasing wealth of what we end up calling the middle classes. And in France and Germany, the Reformation is political, but it's also really markedly a theological battle that's being fought from below, in tension with Catholic hierarchy, and in some cases, many cases, with civil authority, right? In England, the Reformation's happening in a really different way. Henry VIII wants to divorce Catherine of Aragon, right, who was originally married to his older brother, Arthur, for about 5 months, and Arthur had died at age 15. Henry wanted the Pope to annul his marriage, Henry's marriage, so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, and also because he wanted to have a son, which he was not having with Catherine of Aragon. Henry had a daughter with his first wife, Catherine, that's Mary. He would not normally have had such a difficulty annulling his first marriage, but the papacy at that point was under siege by the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Holy Roman Emperor was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So there were theological questions for sure, and political questions. And then there was also this huge tactical question of alliances and other kinds of shifts that didn't really have that much to do with England. So it's a breaking away that happens from many different reasons, right? Henry began to cut back the power of the papacy in England. He thought of himself as a Catholic. He was not really a reformer of the church per se, but he wanted control over the church in his own kingdom. He was focused on consolidating the power of the monarchy and increasingly centralizing the government. That was a big concern of the Tudor monarchs. In 1534, he forced his courtiers to take the oath of his ministers to take the oath of supremacy, which made it treason not to swear that Henry was the supreme governor of the church in England. But he still thought of it as the Catholic Church. There certainly were others who were not as powerful as Henry, who were much more Protestant leaning and much more reform minded, but Henry was in some ways a more tactical, what should we say, like a tactical destroyer of church authority in the interests of establishing the authority of the crown, right? So it's a highly political Reformation in England. Henry dissolved the monasteries in the late 1530s, and that made the monarch and the aristocrats in England very wealthy. These were power grabs as much as they were religious reforms. But reform-minded English people and English clergy and English scholars were encouraged, and they were highly influential. Anne and Henry had their child Elizabeth in 1533. They had no son, of course, and Anne Boleyn was executed for adultery, incest, witchcraft, and treason in 1536. Henry married Jane Seymour. They had a son, Edward VI, in 1537. Jane Seymour died shortly after Edward was born. Henry went on to marry Anne of Cleves. That marriage was annulled without consummation. And then he married Catherine Howard in 1540 and had her beheaded for adultery in 1542. Which she actually did. It's something, kind of an accomplishment if you're married to Henry VIII, to be actually guilty of the crimes for which you're executed. And he married Catherine Parr in 1543. And during this last marriage, Catherine Parr herself was very Protestant-minded and a very interesting Reformation thinker. And during his marriage to her, Henry reconciled with his two daughters, Anne and Elizabeth, and restored them to the succession. They'd been declared illegitimate. When Henry died in 1547, his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, presided over what became a much more Reformation-minded court. England was a magnet then for reformers who were being endangered on the continent. And so there's a great influx of Reformation thinkers, and England becomes a pretty cutting-edge Reformation place. They allowed married clergy, stained glass was not allowed, religious statues, et cetera. Not that all the stained glass was taken out of England in 20 minutes, right? Or statues. I mean, the progress of the reforms in England was extremely unsteady, faced lots of opposition in some places that were still really Catholic. And even where people supported Protestant reforms, they were enacted in an uneven way across the country. There isn't a standing police force. There aren't mechanisms for enforcing this kind of thing or supervising in the Tudor government of this period. You can't just kind of snap your fingers and have a new law go into effect and be carried out. So it's an uneven process of reform. One of the key mechanisms of Reformation in England was the formulation of the Book of Common Prayer. That's our prayer book that is a recasting of Catholic liturgy and Protestantizing of liturgy, and formalizing of it so that the Mass in particular will be said in English, so that the daily office, morning and evening prayer, will be prayed throughout the kingdom in English. And so that the Reformation understanding of the sacraments is also instantiated in a book, and thus in the worship of the people. In 1549, there was both dismay because the book was too Catholic and dismay because the book was too Protestant, which is to say that it was kind of in the middle. Much more so in the second book in 1552, there was intense Protestant reform work going on there. And that was a much more radically reformed book. When Henry died in 1553, he had just a 6-year reign. So not only was he a child when he came to the throne, when Henry died in when Henry died in 1553 and Mary Tudor became queen, England became Roman Catholic. The Protestant reformers who didn't flee to the continent at that point were killed. Right? So it's very important to remember, I'm sorry, I keep calling him Edward. It's very important to remember that when you make the transition from Henry VIII to Edward VI to Mary Tudor, you've gone from Catholicism being overtaken by the English crown to radical Protestantism at court to Catholicism. Right? And with each of those shifts, the official religion changes. The Protestant reformers who had fled to England in the reign of Edward for protection, of course, at this point now we're in danger because there's a Catholic monarch on the throne. And then they fled to the continent or were killed, right? And there were immense martyrdoms during this time. Mary died in 1558, so her reign was also very short, and Elizabeth became the queen in 1558. In 1559, the Book of Common Prayer is brought back from its Catholic period under Mary, right? The church's Catholic period. There's a Protestant book again in 1559, and it is a fully compromising book. The words of administering communion in that book are the Protestant understanding and the Catholic understanding sort of pushed together famously. In the Elizabethan church, there's a really strong emphasis on order. The thing that was said at the time is that we don't make windows into people's hearts. We're not going to seek out and violate their consciences as long as they are participating in the worship of the church, obeying the laws, doing what people are supposed to do. We aren't going to probe too deeply to figure out whether they're sincere Protestants or not. Which is to say that Elizabeth had both Catholic and Puritan foes, right? People who thought that her reforms were either heretically radical or dreadfully not radical enough. Elizabeth was officially excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 1570, and the Pope at that time kind of let it be known that assassinating her would not be a terrible thing, which of course increased the paranoia in England about Catholics. Catholics were really not allowed to obey Elizabeth, and the Pope referred to her as the pretended Queen of England. So at this point, Catholicism is equivalent to sedition, right? But Elizabeth did consolidate the Church of England, kept her opponents on both sides more or less under control. This was a violent process. There were more martyrdoms during this period. It's a violent process, period. Right? Radical Protestants are imprisoned. Jesuits have a famous sort of mission to come and try to convert the English back to Catholicism, and they are being executed and sought out by priest hunters. And it's a period of tremendous trauma about the Reformation. Elizabeth dies in 1603. James I, who is the great grandson of Henry VIII's sister, just so you know, and the son of Mary Stuart, whom Elizabeth had executed for fomenting rebellion against her. James I was the King of Scotland as well as the King of England. He resisted the Puritans. They had actually initially thought that he was going to be really friendly to them. They had presented him with a petition to reform the church. He shut that process down. But he also had strong Catholic opposition. So in that sense, he's sort of continuing Elizabeth's policies. And he was very much less willing to tolerate Catholics than he initially seemed like he was going to be. So there's Guy Fawkes Day, right? From 1605 on, Guy Fawkes, the radical Catholic who tried to blow up Parliament with King James in it, right? So there were plots against the throne. James was very pro-bishop, very much about the authority of the monarchy and the authority of the church. But again, that was a church that was officially traveling this sort of middle path between Catholicism and Protestantism. Under James's son, Charles I, who ascends to the throne in 1625, when James dies, there were growing tensions. Charles I pressed not only Catholic sounding forms of worship, and his wife was Catholic and she was allowed to worship as a Catholic at court. He also tried to impose an even more hierarchical and bishop-centered structure on the church, not only in England, but in Scotland, where they were more Presbyterian, right? They were less hierarchically organized in the first place. And to have the English Scottish king imposing a more Catholic sounding and hierarchical and bishop-centered structure on the church was a terrible idea. It imploded on him along with war and financial ruin, etc. And he ended up ruling without Parliament for 11 years. And when Parliament was able to come back, and they took action against him as soon as they could, by 1642, war breaks out in England. The parliamentary forces, the Protestant forces, more radically Protestant forces take over the government. Charles is beheaded in 1649. And from 1649 to 1660, the Book of Common Prayer is not printed in England. It's forbidden, right? There are no bishops. And there is a lot of absolutely fascinating anti-hierarchical religious fervor and experimentation and practice in England. Prophesying predictions of the end times, women prophets, radical communitarianism, a lot of stuff that basically terrified the English hierarchy. Right? The monarchy is restored in 1660 with Charles II, right, the son of the Charles who was beheaded. The Book of Common Prayer is established again, and that remains the official prayer book of England from 1662. It remains the official prayer book of England because it requires an act of parliament to revise the prayer book in England. And increasingly, parliament has not wanted to get involved, as you can imagine, in revising the Book of Common Prayer. And so there are supplemental prayer books in England that get used, get drafted by the church and used. But the official Book of Common Prayer is still the one from the reign of Charles II in the 1660s. Our prayer book has been revised several times and will be again, right? But theirs just gets supplemented. Charles II dies in 1685. His brother, James II, becomes king. James II is Catholic, right? So picture having gone through this radical, bloody, terrifying civil war, right, in the 17th century, unsteadily putting a Protestant monarch back in the throne, having him die, and then having his Catholic brother arrive. He was tolerated until he had a male heir. And then at that point, Parliament took action to make sure that there would not be Catholic kings in England. They brought James II's daughter, Mary, and her husband, William, who were both Protestants, to the throne. This is known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. So there's this fragile sense of civil order in England and religious order, and the two are absolutely connected. And the famous moderation of the Anglican Church has everything to do with raging anxiety about civil disorder, right? That sense of order was consolidated in part by a continuing intense crackdown on what they called enthusiasts, or radical Protestants and Catholics. And I'll just read for you this little clip, a little description of the fear of what was called enthusiasm or radical Protestantism, the belief that the Holy Spirit could be active in your heart in a way that you would be able to recognize, that would inspire you, and especially that would inspire you to do something that didn't go absolutely in lockstep with the teachings of the church and the structure and the hierarchy and the norms of the church. So this is just a little passage I want to read to you from a history of this period. Born at the end of the 17th century, the famous writer Joseph Butler inherited a deep Anglican suspicion of the Holy Spirit's work among the people. The 17th century had seen a bloody civil war, factionalism, radical new sects that allowed women the right to prophesy, powerful claims for individual conscience over and against the teachings of the established church. And all of that pointed toward chaos and the demise of the established order. And much of it was fueled by the belief that the Holy Spirit was guiding the new radicals. Though Butler is, of course, famous for his arguments against the notion of deism, the idea that God puts the world together like a watch and stands back and watches it run. He's famous for arguing against that, but he's also famous for his classically Anglican response to John Wesley. And you remember that John Wesley is one of the founders of Methodism, the Methodist Church, a much more emotive, spirit-led, edging toward spontaneous form of religion, right? So John Wesley has claimed that the Holy Spirit has moved him. His heart has been warmed by the Holy Spirit. And Butler, Joseph Butler's famous response is, "Sir, the pretending to extraordinary revelations and gifts of the Holy Spirit is a horrid thing, a very horrid thing." What may be most fully Anglican here is the pairing of Butler and Wesley, one claiming to have his heart strangely warmed while the other recognizes that there is no such direct pathway to certainty about the Spirit's action outside the established church. And not only, of course, are they disagreeing about whether you can be certain, they're disagreeing about whether God is to be found in the action of the heart in the people, or whether God is to be found in the traditional and really sort of rationalistic church that has taken hold of England by the 18th century. For good reasons. Again, well, I don't know if I think they're good, but I mean, for notable reasons, the English church has survived tremendous turmoil, and the civil order of England and much of Europe, in fact, seems to be dependent on a religion that doesn't allow for too much inspiration to individuals, and that at the same time isn't too Catholic, but treads this very careful, ritualistic, and above all, orderly line between what it identifies as extremes of Protestant and Catholic. Okay, that's our summary of the church in England up to the 18th century. It's crazy short. But the 18th century is, of course, when the American Revolution takes place, and that's where we're going to pick up. Thanks.